Welcome everyone. I'm sorry I can't be with you this evening, but I thought I would share some of my thinking with you as I make my SLO and PPG. I am Annette Schwallenberg. I'm a science teacher from Appleton West High School. We met at the opening training for new teachers. So welcome everyone, and let me get started. So my SLO process, the goal I have for you is that I am going to model how I develop and implement my SLO. And today I want to talk you through this process, and we will continue then and work on the PPG as well when we are finished. The process of planning my SLO and PPG involve answering many important questions, and I've organized this presentation by those questions, and we'll start with looking at some whys, some whens, whos, whats, and hows. And here we go. So why do I want to do an SLO? Well, the obvious answer is that it's required for educator effectiveness. But beyond that, I'm looking forward to doing another SLO because I've learned that it can help me track student learning. Instead of it being about what I present, it becomes about what my students are really learning. And as a high school teacher, I didn't get a lot of that in my education courses, so it's something new for me to learn right along with you new teachers, and it's really exciting. Evaluating my practice is a second reason that I love doing SLOs, because it gives me some hard data. Being a science person, I love that hard data, and it gives me some data to actually look at how am I doing as a teacher. It also gives me something to discuss in my PLCs. That's where a lot of that evaluation process takes place. It gives me an opportunity then to improve as a teacher. It doesn't matter if you've been teaching 1 year or 20 years or 30 years or beyond, you are constantly striving to improve, and tracking student data through an SLO really helps with that process. When do I do each of the steps of the SLO process? Well, from May to August, I look at previous year's data. I know that that's something that you as new teachers don't have, but within your PLC, some of the people in there should be able to support you in finding data sources. We also have data sources through EduClimber that you can look at, looking at the students that you have now and their previous year's data. Then in September and October, I actually am going to collect preliminary data. Now, you may be basing your SLO on data that's already in EduClimber, but you need to look at the data that is for the students that you currently have. So you'll have to go in there and look at the individual students in a particular area. And also within the months of September and October, I'm going to be working together with my PLC to develop my SLO as a SMART goal. Then in October through April, I scaffold and teach the concepts and the skills that I want my students to learn to support, that will give me the data for them and what they're growing and learning throughout the year. I will collect formative assessment data. FA stands for formative assessment data, because I want to make sure that I'm not basing my SLO on just 1 or 2 data points. I want to have very regular data so that I have a clear picture of how my students are learning and growing, and so that I can tackle problems early on and address issues and help to support them through maybe RTI processes. Students also will be in October through April tracking their own learning growth, as well as I will be tracking their learning growth, and we'll discuss that later in the presentation. So, who's doing this planning? Well, in my particular case, I am a member of the Appleton West 10th grade Life Science Teachers Professional Learning Community, along with Julie Branner and Jen Black and Susan Natrip and Natalie Detienne. As you can see, we're a variety of teachers. Julie and I are science teachers, and Jen and Susan are special ed teachers, and Natalie is our student teacher, and we are including all of these people in the planning process. It's very nice to have a group of people that are from such diverse backgrounds when you're putting together something like a student learning objective. It's also a good thing to do this with a PLC because you can share and compare data. You can support each other when a strategy isn't working. Somebody else in the group is going to have a better strategy as you scaffold and support your students through their learning process. So what should we focus on? Well, there's some areas that you can choose from. You could choose your content ELOs or essential learning objectives. You could choose district or building CSIP goals. You could choose something that you can see when you look at the past student data is an area of need for your students, or you can choose based on current student data, giving them some sort of test like a MAPS test at the beginning of the year may give you some clues as to what your students need to improve in. Best of all is if you can choose a topic that includes all of these. And for me, the topic that I have chosen, I chose it last year and I'm going to continue with it this year, is focusing on vocabulary. Particularly the science vocabulary my students need to be successful on the ACT Aspire test, because that encompasses a science objective, the next generation science standards, and our Appleton Area School District science standards want students to acquire academic vocabulary. If I look at our CSIP goals, both district and building goals, we're talking about students being better readers and writers and speakers and listeners, and all of those hinge on a good knowledge of vocabulary. If I look at my student data from many years past and in many different modes, the students that I have in my life science courses struggle with new vocabulary acquisition and being able to apply academic vocabulary. So my PLC has talked about this and decided that that will be our goal for this year as well as it was for last year. So who should I focus on? Well, I could focus on all the students I see in a day. I could focus on a single class hour, or I could define a group, particularly a gap group, a group that has been defined by data found in WiseDash as being a group that needs particular support. Or I could look at the data that I collect from my initial test, my pre-test, and just pick students below a cut score, so just on a need-based group. What I've chose to focus on last year was a needs-based group. This year I'm going to focus on a defined group, and I'll tell you why our group has decided to do that. One of the things is our CSIP is focusing on cultural responsiveness, and if you look at the WiseDash data for the state, for our district, you can see that minority students generally score about 50% below their Caucasian peers in both vocabulary reading type skills, reading and writing type skills, as well as their science scores. So knowing that, I know that I'll have a lot of support from the district in developing my cultural responsiveness skills, and I know it's an area of need for my own students. So that's the group I've chosen, and we'll look at the actual data for that coming up. Okay. So what does my current class data show me? Well, in my 10th grade life science students on their third day of school, I gave them a vocabulary test that we'll talk about a little later, but it's the essential life science vocabulary test. And my class average, 29 students, had a 46% average, which isn't surprising because this is all primarily vocabulary words that would be new to them. The range went from 18 to 77%. And then when I look specifically at minority students, I can see that the 9 students that I have in that group scored at an average of 37.04%, with a range from the 18.52 to 66%. And so I can see that there's definitely a need if I want my students to be achieving at greater than 80%, which is a goal I have for myself and for my students. It means a B average. And so if I want my students to be achieving there, all of the students within my class group, as well as my minority group, do need to improve quite a bit to get to that point. And I do know that even if I by just focusing on providing support and structure that will help my minority students, it will help my entire class to improve. So I'm not concerned that I'm leaving any students out by just selecting to track the data on that smaller group of students. I will still continue to do interventions for other students in my whole class if they're struggling to achieve the 80% I've targeted. Okay, so how do I write a good SLO? Well, within Teachscape, the Wisconsin Teacher Student Learning Objective Planning and Monitoring Form is found. And right now, unfortunately, that part of the Teachscape Reflect program is not working like it should. So you have all received a fillable form that contains the same questions and guiding information. So if the tool becomes available, I would suggest going directly into Teachscape. But if not, please use our district fillable forms, and I'm sure Linda will be talking more about that later in the presentation. So let's take a look at how I go about those fillable forms with my PLC. So the first part is giving some baseline data and some rationale. And as you can see, I'm doing this because I have examined our past district-wide assessment data, unit test data, a variety of different data from my students, and I know that they really struggle in decoding those novel words, and that really stands in their way from them being successful in my class. And as we prepare them for the ACT Aspire, I know that it really stands in their way for being successful on tests like that. And so what we did a couple years ago in our building was all the different department PLCs got together and developed lists of what's called Tier 2 vocabulary. They are content-specific vocabulary words that are essential for students to be successful on an ACT. And that concept is outlined in Marzano and Sims from the 2013 edition. And so what we did was define 25 words that we want them, biology terms that we think our students should learn, and those are the terms that I'm using for or that my PLC is using for their process of developing and monitoring their SLO. So how do I write a good SLO when it comes to learning and the learning content and the grade level? Well, I look at the Common Core, and I know that one of the important standards in the Common Core in the discipline literacy section is vocabulary acquisition and use for grades 9 and 10. I teach grade 10 for life science. And then I look at the NGSS, which is the Next Generation Science Standards framework, and I know that looking at the practices there, argumentation, modeling, some of those practices certainly require my students to have that basic science vocabulary. And then as I look at resources from the ACT and the ACT Aspire, I can see that vocabulary is essential for those students to be successful on those tests. So we know that they require the students to use proficient science vocabulary and to be able to clarify the terms and apply them in reading, writing, speaking, and listening at a level that makes them prepared for college and career. And so if I want to do that, I'm going to need to teach them this essential vocabulary and I want to know that they've learned it, so I'm going to monitor it, so it makes a great SLO. Also, it's a wonderful SLO because this is something that continues throughout my school year. It doesn't matter what topic I'm actually addressing in a unit, there will be essential vocabulary words in that unit. So every single unit I will be able to do some sort of formative assessment for this SLO. So the student population I described earlier is those 9 minority students in my first hour life science class, and that I want them to achieve an 80%, and so far they have not achieved that. Right now they are about a little less than 10% below their non-minority peers, and so I have some work to do. So how do I write a good SLO when it comes to targeted growth? As I mentioned, I want to take them from that 37.04% up to an 80% this year. Last year I aimed for 70%, which was our vocabulary benchmark score that we wanted for kids, and otherwise they had to retake. And the kids achieve that before the end of the school year, so I know that it's reasonable for me to bump it that little bit and go for 80 right off the bat. I am going to say though that I'm going to have that for 90% of my students. Now I do want every student to learn, and I will teach in a way and support in a way that has every student achieving that goal. But I do know that circumstances happen in my students' lives, and that in order to be reasonable I may not be able to get 100%, so I'm going to aim for that 90%. Now the time interval, that's pretty much defined by me. I have a year-long course. I'll be having a year-long SLO, which will run from September of this year through April of next year, because by April of next year I need to score my SLO so that I can sit, if it's in my summative year like it was last year, I had to sit down with my administrator and evaluate my goal. This year I'll be scoring it myself with my PLC group, but I still need to do that in plenty of time before the end of the school year. So evidence, where am I going to get some evidence for my student growth? Well, one way I'm going to get evidence is through the Life Science Essential Vocabulary Test. It's an ACT formatted test with those Tier 2 biology vocabulary terms that was set out by my department a couple of years ago. And then, as I mentioned earlier, along the way I'm going to be doing a ton of formative assessments. So every unit test, every quiz I give are going to have a few of these essential terms that I can use to evaluate where my students are at. I will also use some Quizlets and some quick writes, some annotated reading, flashcards, graphic organizers. I do portfolio interviews, formal writing assignments, all of which I expect my students to be utilizing these vocabulary terms, and I can be getting a sense of where they're at and collecting some data to show their growth with those tools. My actual SLO reads, 90% of students in minority populations in first hour life science will increase their scores on a list of 25 Tier 2 science vocabulary words to 80% on an ACT style vocabulary test by the end of April 2015. So there, now I've written my goal, and you notice that it is in SMART format, which means that it's specific. I have defined that it's going to be those 9 minority students in first hour life science. I have said that it's going to, I'm looking at 90% of them, and 90% of them reaching the goal. It's measurable because I know that I want them to achieve 80%, and I know right now that they're in the mid 30%. It's attainable because of my experience from last year, and I know that some of you might be concerned how am I going to set that attainable goal and not pick something that's unattainable? Well, there is a fail-safe in here. At mid-year, you will be allowed to sit down either with your PLC, well, in your case, it'll be with your administrator. In my case, because I'm not in a summer year, it'll be with my PLC, and I can reevaluate that. If it looks like my students are already close to 80% at mid-year, I can raise that percentage. If it looks like I have overreached, I can bring that percentage back. I just need to explain using data why I've chosen to make those adjustments. And the same thing will go if you meet with your administrator. You'll have to use data to explain why you need to adjust it at that point. But you are allowed to change your SLO at the midterm. All right, so how am I going to make sure every student is achieving that SLO learning goal? I've talked about that a little bit already, but let's take a deeper look at that. So first of all, it's in how I teach. So I can use, there's a variety of resources that I have in my tool chest about teaching students vocabulary. I can use Marzano's 6 steps. I will utilize gradual release responsibility. I will do some word dissections using something called the 30-15-10, which is a list of prefixes, roots, and suffixes that are commonly found in academic vocabulary. I will use my word wall, flashcard activity, electronic Quizlets, close reads that focus on vocabulary, graphic organizers. I have some note-taking grids, a sketch to stretch that I do where the students draw a picture of some concept and then use their vocabulary terms to explain their picture. I can do some quick writes at the end of hours that are a good way of measuring and getting students to develop their vocabulary because they're applying the terms that they've learned in a recent lesson. And then guided academic conversations. The rule that I've heard is that students need to use a vocabulary word about 14 times before it's theirs, and that's using it correctly. And so this variety of ways of teaching vocabulary and helping students utilize vocabulary will give them those 14 opportunities without boring them to tears, and give them some fun and engaging ways to, and a little competition here and there, so that the experience is something that they want to do. So some other resources that I'd be using, a couple of books that I found useful. One is called WordWise, Content Rich, another one, Academic Conversations. Have been very, very useful in developing some strategies so that my students are supported as they learn their vocabulary. A few authors that I really reach out to when it comes to vocabulary development and formative assessment tools are Fisher and Fry. For science-specific examples, a woman named Paige Keeley has done wonderful work. Marzano, Moss, and Brookert. Moss and Brookert wrote the the WordWise book that I just referred to. Some of the people in my building that have also been a big help and will continue to be in developing vocabulary and helping my students to learn vocabulary are my special ed team teacher, my tech integrator who can show me ways to utilize technology and make the process of learning vocabulary more interesting for my students. My PLC, we can bounce ideas off of each other. We can share resources. And at West, we have literacy support specialist team that will also do some coaching, some staff development, and help us learn new vocabulary strategies. They also have a resource page that they put together that is just indispensable in that process. Okay, how do I make sure my students are achieving their goals? with regard to the minority population that I'm targeting? Well, I want to look for some resources that engage me in cultural responsiveness and teaching for cultural responsiveness. This year, Appleton West is doing a book study on engaging students with poverty in mind by Eric Jensen. I think Wilson Middle School's looking at that book, and a few others as well. Another book that I ran across that I'm going to be looking into is this Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain by Zaretta Hammond. It seems really intriguing, and I can't wait to get my hands on it. So I'll be using that to help me with particularly supporting my target group. Some of the people that can help me with my target group are our cultural support staff. We have the district-wide cultural support staff. We also have someone particularly employed here at Appleton West that helps us out with our Latino population. The ELL staff here at West and in the district are great resources when it comes to cultural responsiveness. The CSIP team, we've had some experiences there with learning about cultural responsiveness, and I'm sure that there'll be some staff development that will continue throughout the year looking at cultural responsiveness, since that's one of our targeted groups this year. Okay, and this is probably one of the things that last year made the most difference for me in helping my students learn and achieve their my SLO. And that was, first of all, I already talked about the tracking, recording, and progress from a teacher perspective, that you need all of those formative assessments and the summative assessments. And for those, I just made myself a Google Doc to keep track of those, or Google spreadsheet to keep track of that data. This year, it looks like we're going to be able to do that in EduClimber, and I'm really excited about that. I can't wait to learn how to do that, and that training is being rolled out little by little as we go through this year. But the part that really helped my students most is having the students track their own data, and I did that in two ways. One is I gave them their list of essential vocabulary in a table, and they had to, as they learn the words, record definitions, record examples, and develop memory tools for them. And then I gave them a spreadsheet of that list of words, and throughout the year, periodically, at least twice a quarter, they had to rate themselves on how well they understood those vocabulary terms. And they would do this immediately following some type of formative assessment. Maybe I had them do a Quizlet online quiz, or we did a Kahoot in class, or they took an actual pencil paper quiz. And then they would go through the words in the essential vocabulary list, and they would rate themselves. 0 if they'd never heard of the word, 1 if they've heard it but they didn't know what it meant, 2 if they kind of think they know the word but they're not sure, it would be a guess, and a 3 of, oh yeah, they could teach this word to a peer. They wouldn't even have to have choices on a multiple choice test. And the students would rate themselves, and I was really amazed. They took it very seriously, and they really engaged in that process, and I really think it helped them target which words they still needed to learn and to do better on their final essential vocabulary test at the end of the year. I think that is why my students outpaced my goal of 70% and ended up into the 80%. That is also something I've talked to a few elementary teachers, and maybe that for the 4 rankings there might be a little complicated for some of the students in elementary school, but what they might be able to do is some sort of sticker process. Yes, I know this. No, I don't. Smiley faces, sad faces, something like that they could do to keep track of that process of how they're growing and learning. Well, that brings us to a close for the teaching of the SLO process and my modeling that for you. I'm going to give a minute here, and I'm going to stop here and let you guys talk it over with Linda. and then I'll move on and talk about my process for my PPG. Okay, the PPG process. Let's talk about that a little bit. Again, I want to model and show you how I'm going to develop and implement my PPG process. Now, I will admit to you, the PPG process that I'm showing you here is actually mine from last year. I haven't gotten as far as putting together my PPG process for this year, but I think I can show you the process from that. So, why do you do... Oh, sorry for the interruption. I needed to close my door. All right, so let's get back with this. Why do you want to do a professional practice goal? Well, it's to develop your best practice teaching skills, and that would come from the Danielson framework. That is the other part of our evaluation. It also would support my SLO and grow my ability to meet the CSIP goals in my building. In the case of the particular SLO I'm working on, it would help to reach both a literacy goal as well as a cultural responsiveness goal. And it would help me to become a better teacher. So when do I want to do this? September through October, I'm going to complete the Danielson Framework Self-Evaluation. And I've done that already, and set my SMART PPG goal. For the rest of the year, I'm going to find opportunities to learn new teaching skills by attending professional development, doing book studies, collaborating with colleagues, and participating in professional organizations. Like was the WSST, which is the Science Teachers Professional Organization, and also Fox Valley Writing Association. So how do I write a good PPG? We use that same type of framework that we had for SLO that's provided in Teachscape. And again, you may not be able to use Teachscape. You might have to use the fillable form. So my SMART goal from last year was to do that running record and to have my students be keeping their own record of their own mastery in science. And some of the tools I used to determine that that was what I was going to do was a knowledge of a book called Visible Learning for Teachers by John Hattie, where he shows that students keeping their own record of learning has one of the best outcomes for student achievement. Also, I know from looking at the Danielson framework that that student tracking their learning is the best teaching practice. So that kind of sent me in that direction. I also knew that if I was tracking the data, it would help support their vocabulary acquisition. So it all lines up, and that's the best way to do this, is that you want to be able to have your PPG line up with your SLO, with your building goals, because then you're going to receive the professional development right there in your building with your PLC to be able to achieve something that is going to be good for your kids as well as for your own teaching growth. And so that's the way I've done that. And it's worked well. It worked well last year, so I'm going to stick to it again this year. Like I said, I don't know exactly what I'm going to target, but this is what I did for last year. And then, as I said, I can find why that's important within the Danielson framework, particularly 4B. Standard 4B, maintaining accurate records, and that's having the students keep track of their own data and me keeping track of their data as well. And using assessment in instruction, that's using all those formative assessments and having the students keep track very often rather than those big chunks. And I found that to be really useful last year in helping me grow as a teacher and helping my students achieve their SLO. I went over these before, but there's a whole variety of things that I'm going to do in order to support my students as they're developing their SLO. And finally, some of the resources that I mentioned before, again, are going to help me as I move forward in my SLO. Those books that I'm going to read, move forward in my PPG. Those books that I'm going to read and those people that supported me in my SLO will also help me develop new strengths, or did last year as I went through and tried to achieve my PPG. The district this year will be offering quite a bit on cultural responsiveness, so that as I develop my PPG for this year, I'm probably going to put a focus on that area. But the PPG then, just so that you recall, does not need to be scored at the end of the year. It's really the scoring of your SLO is going to show that you've been working on your PPG, because if you are working to improve your teaching, and I know that, like I said, last year that really worked for me. It helped my students be successful with their SLO.